Here we
Hey,
are. Okay.
so yeah, welcome to Service Mesh Academy. I think William and I are both waiting for the other one to talk, so I guess I'll just go. Um, yeah, this is Service Mesh Academy for July. It's July, right? Uh, as
It
we get
is.
started here, if you want to go and put where you are into the Slack channel, that would be great. The workshops channel on the Linkerd Slack is the one that we're talking about. And yeah, we'll give people a couple minutes there and then we'll get rolling with the presentation. Washington, D.C. Shocking. Okay, so far Luke is winning for South Florida for the distance competition. I guess it depends on where we're measuring from, right? Because like
Yeah.
Montreal is much
Exactly.
closer to me in the Boston area than South Florida is, but I guess it's not closer to you. Or yeah,
Well, if we
yeah.
measure from
Dublin,
the center of the Earth, then everyone's equal.
everyone's equal. Exactly.
Except people who live at higher elevations.
Or anybody joining it from the ISS. That'd be kind of fun. Argentina. I don't know which. Yeah, we're gonna have to define the centroid for buoyant or something like that. All right. Well, I think we can go ahead and get started then.
Yeah, let's do it.
All right. So I'm going to leave that banner up for the workshops channel for just a minute there, but this is certificate management with Linkerd. We realized a little while ago that we'd done this recently as a Cloud Native Live, but never as a Service Mesh Academy, so decided that we should remedy that. I am Flynn. If I can find my mouse, I will put my contact information up there. I guess I'll go ahead and take this off. Remember the workshops channel on the Linkerd Slack if you want to chime in here. Um, you can always find me as at Flynn on the Linkerd Slack or basically all the other Slacks that I can think of. And it's not up here, but you can email me as flynn@buoyant.io as well. So
I'm William.
today, oh yeah, you should introduce yourself, William. I'm sure
I'm just
people don't
here
know
to
who they are.
supervise and make sure no one gets into trouble. So, hey everyone, I'm William Morgan. I end up doing a lot of talking about Linkerd, as does Flynn. Flynn's going to be doing most of the hard, the hard stuff here. I'll just be relaxing in the back and chatting people up and interjecting snide comments.
As you do so well. In all seriousness, though, if you put questions in the workshop channel in Slack, then William should be able to just go ahead and interrupt, as he does so well, to get your question answered or to decide that it'll get answered later. We also have Eric, another buoyant guy, who is going to be keeping an eye on the channel and may be able to answer some questions there as well directly. But yeah, if you have questions, dive on in and we will try to get them answered. On the agenda today, we're primarily doing a workshop, but we need to do some background first to talk about the way certificates work and certificate hierarchies and how Linkerd uses a certificate and how you rotate them and all this stuff. So we're going to do all of that fairly quickly, and then we're going to go into the workshop. But first, we need to talk a little bit about tools that you need. You will need a Kubernetes cluster. Please make sure your Kubernetes cluster is empty. Do not try to run this against your production cluster. Bad things will happen. You will need the Linkerd CLI, the Step CLI, the Helm CLI. It might be helpful to have the Cert-manager CLI as well, CM control. It's also worth noting we are going to be using Linkerd 2.13, specifically 2.13.5. That is the latest and greatest. And if you go check out the buoyant.io MTLS guide, you will find a whole lot of background information that kind of underlies a lot of what we're going to be talking about today. Also, I think William
Spent
wrote
a
that.
lot of time writing that guide.
So he might
take you a
have
long time to read through all of it, and so save it for when you're having trouble falling asleep at night.
Yeah, there's a lot there. It's good stuff. Next up, a brief message from our sponsors. We have a new forum. You can find it at linkerd.buoyant.io, or you can scan the QR code there. Slack is great, but if you post questions on the forum, they won't disappear, and you can search for them later. And so it's generally a great resource for trying to help us help you. Hope to see you there.
We've got some good activity on that forum. We've got really good activity on it.
I've been happy about that. We also have the Fundamentals of the Service Mesh online course. You can go through that. You can get certified. You can share your certification online and brag to all your friends. You can let us know what you'd like to see in the more advanced course that we're starting to put together as well. William, did you have anything that you wanted to add about that one?
Well, if you do this course, you get a certification that you can put on your LinkedIn that says, I have been certified in the fundamentals of the service mesh. And then, like Flynn said, we're going to do an advanced course, which will give you another fancy certificate. But I think the course is actually quite hard. So, be prepared. There's online components, there's reading, there's questions, there's answers. You have to get a certain amount right.
I think you have to get all of them 100% right, actually. I'm not going to lie. I went through it quickly at one point and missed one or two. So yeah, there's some challenge in there. Okay, the last message from the sponsor. You may not have heard about this, but there is a Buoyant Enterprise Linkerd distribution now, and we are opening up some more early access slots for people who want to check that out. William is the guy to talk to about this. You can go bug him on Slack, and I guess I'll turn it over to you, William, to talk about this one.
Yeah, just find me on the Slack. Really, we've got super cool stuff in here, but this is an enterprise-focused offering, so it's really going to make sense if you have a set of enterprise constraints. So I would love to talk to you about this. There's some really cool stuff, especially if you're running multiple availability zones and trying to reduce cloud spend and stuff like that. So just ping me on the Slack, and we'll get a conversation started.
And who are you on Slack?
I'm William Morgan (Buoyant). You'll find me.
Excellent, cool. Yeah, the some of the multi-AZ stuff actually is shaping up to be really cool. That's going to be fun to play with more soon. Okay. All right. Back to background before our workshop. So Linkerd, you probably already know this. It's an infrastructure component. It adds security, reliability, and observability to your application. Today is all about security. We are not going to talk about reliability or observability in this particular Service Mesh Academy. There are many others where we do. But today is all about security. And to understand the security stuff we're getting at, we're going to do a little bit of background on public key cryptography itself, which is one of the most difficult things to say in this entire workshop. Public key crypto is the basis of trust in Linkerd. It's a relatively simple idea with a lot of more complex ramifications. Instead of having a single encryption key where you encrypt and decrypt with the same key, we're going to split that into a key pair. We have a public key, we have a private key. If you encrypt with the public key, you have to decrypt with the private key. If you encrypt with the private key, you have to decrypt with the public key. Like I said, it's a straightforward idea, but it has a lot of ramifications. The other important point here is that one of the constraints to make all this stuff works is that if you only have access to the public key, recovering the private key is impossible, by which we actually mean will take you a ridiculously long period of time, so don't even try. Now, if Alice encrypts something with Bob's public key, then only Bob will be able to read it. This is one of the cool ramifications here. The reason this works is that, yeah, Alice may have Bob's public key, but in order to decrypt this information, you need Bob's private key. And if Bob is doing things correctly, he's the only person on the planet who has his private key. Likewise, if Alice encrypts something with her own private key, then only she could have written that because she's the only one on the planet that has her private key. This sounds weird, but it's actually very common in practice. It's so common in practice that the specific operation of hashing some data and then signing the hash with your own private key. See, I did it. I got ahead of myself there. This operation is called signing. It is taking a hash of some data and then encrypting it with your own private key. It happens so often that it gets a special name of signing. So The cool thing about public key cryptography is that it allows you to be able to safely communicate and do authentication whether or not you've ever communicated with the other party before, as long as you have their public key. MTLS actually relies on this, and Linkerd authentication relies on MTLS. To make it work, though, you must keep private keys private, because private keys form the basis of identity. And you really need to distribute the public keys all over the place so that people who want to use the private keys for identity can verify the identity that they're seeing. The challenge here is that actually keeping track of all of these keys is really annoying. And so the TLS world, the public key crypto world, a long time ago, like back in the 90s, came up with this idea of a certificate, which is a fancy name. Technically, it's an X.509 certificate. It's a fancy name for a data structure that binds a subject to a key pair. And for our purposes here, a subject is effectively just a name. So in this certificate over here that I've shown, you can see the subject. That CN equals part means common name equals. And in this case, that's the only part of the subject we have. There's a bunch of other crap you could put in there, but we don't need it for service mesh uses. This particular certificate has a subject of identity.linkerd.cluster.local, which is a specific common name that belongs to a specific certificate that Linkerd is going to use in operations. You can also see some information about the public key itself. This is not often all that useful as a human, but it can be relevant if you need it for some things. We can also see that this certificate is signed. There's an issuer up here. Every certificate has a signature to make it so that you can validate the certificate to see if it has been spoofed in order to trust it. This one was issued by root.linkerd.cluster.local, which is another specific common name that Linkerd relies on. And we can also see down at the bottom that there's some information about the signature itself. Two important points here to reiterate: only public information is in this part of the certificate. When you generate certificates, they're split into a public half and a private half. This one is the public half. Everything here is safe to share. There is nothing sensitive in this particular data structure. You can share it all over the place. Likewise, we're going to talk about rotation. There's an axiom in security that the longer you use a specific key, the more valuable it is for somebody to break it. And one of the ways you mitigate this is simply to change out the key pairs often. We call this rotation. Under the hood, it's really replacement. And that's a good thing to bear in mind as we go on to talk about some of this stuff. Okay. Actually, let me back up a moment and reiterate. If you have questions, I know I'm going a little bit quick here. If you have questions, put them in the workshop channel on Slack. We will get to them. There's a lot here. So yeah, if you have questions, chime in. All right. So one of the weird things about certificates that people sometimes find confusing is that we will talk a lot about the hierarchy. There's a hierarchical setup for certificates. In every case, we're going to start with what we call the root CA cert. CA stands for certifying authority. I'm not really going to talk about that beyond that definition right now, but we will start with a root CA cert. And we call it the root because it is the certificate from which trust originates. The root CA is always a self-signed certificate, which means exactly what it sounds like. It literally has a signature from itself on itself. The root CA has to be self-signed because if it were signed by anybody else, then the entity signing it would be the root of trust. So, you end up with this place where you got to stop somewhere. Where you stop is called the root CA. The root CA in turn can be used to sign what we call an intermediate CA cert. The intermediate CA cert can go and sign what we call a leaf cert. This is just a basic tree structure where you have multiple levels in the hierarchy. But this is also a thing that you're going to run into constantly as we talk about Linkerd and certificate management. So it's good to have some concept of where we're coming from. Now, you do not need to stop with only one intermediate CA. You could have a root CA which signs an intermediate, which signs another intermediate, which signs another intermediate, which finally signs a leaf. Likewise, you don't have to have only one leaf. You can have intermediate CAs, or the root CA could sign a leaf directly, although that would be silly, but you can assign multiple leaf certs. Another interesting thing that you can do with this is that you can do this thing called delegation, where you basically tell an application that this middle intermediate CA there, that it should just stop verifying things at that point and effectively treat that one as its root CA. We do this in Linkerd. This is pretty common, and we do it in Linkerd by talking about a thing called the trust anchor. The trust anchor is then used to sign an identity issuer, and the identity issuer is used to do workload certificates. The workload certificates are managed completely by Linkerd. You never have to think about them, although you do have to think about the trust anchor and the identity issuer. And all of that happens in a cluster. If you remember that previous diagram, what we call the trust anchor could in fact be signed by some other certificates out there in the ether. Everything will work fine. This turns out to be important in a bunch of enterprise environments, but we're just going to stop here and be talking about the trust anchor for the rest of this workshop. We do this for a couple of reasons with this two-level thing where we've got the trust anchor and the identity issuer for the workloads. The first one is that it makes rotation simpler, because whenever you rotate a certificate, you also have to rotate all the certificates under it in the hierarchy. So if you rotate a workload certificate, which Linkerd does for you automatically, if you rotate that, then that's the only one that has to be rotated. There is nothing below a workload cert in Linkerd's hierarchy. But if you rotate the identity issuer, then you have to rotate the identity issuer and all of the workload certs. And again, Linkerd manages all the workload certs, so rotating the identity issuer is enough. Linkerd will take care of all the rest of it for you. But if you need to rotate the trust anchor, you will have to deal with the identity issuer to cause the workloads to be picked up. So having this two-level thing means that you can rotate the identity issuer fairly often, and it's fairly simple. Whereas if we only had a trust anchor, that would be much more painful. And we'll talk in greater detail about this as we go through the workshop. The second reason we do things this way is that it permits this arrangement, where you keep the trust anchor outside of your cluster, as you should, but then you can use the same trust anchor to sign the identity issuer in multiple different clusters, at which point workloads in one cluster can just talk to workloads in another cluster, and all of the MTLS stuff just works because they are both existing within this hierarchy that's rooted with the same trust anchor. All right. There's one other thing to talk about here, which is, so far we've been talking about the control plane certificates. There are also webhooks in a Linkerd installation, and they have their own certificates. When you install the webhooks, they all get their own self-signed cert, so there's not really a hierarchy here. If you want to go through and automate this stuff, it's helpful to go and put certs in front of them. They can also all use the same webhook anchor if you want to. That can make things simpler. And again, we'll talk about this as we get into the workshop. One note I want to call out up front is don't use the main Linkerd trust anchor as your webhook anchor. It's just better to keep those two kind of separated because they are very, very different domains of security. All right. William, do you have any heckling or questions or anything like that? I don't see any questions in Slack, but
I had to find the right button there. No, I don't have any heckling or questions. Not yet.
I'm sure we'll get some. All right. So yeah, if any of y'all watching have questions, the Workshops channel is a great place to put them, and that'll help us get to answering them. Okay. So there's all the background that we need to do on certificates and hierarchy and stuff. We got one more bit talking about rotation. A common question as people learn about this stuff is, oh, great, how often should I rotate my certificates? And like so many places in computer science or computing in general, it's not really a science. The answer is it depends on your environment mostly. The thing to remember is that if you do have a certificate get compromised, then it will remain compromised until the next time you rotate it. And you might not know that it has been compromised. So rotating things more quickly helps limit risk and improve your overall security. This is a good thing. On the other hand, rotating them less quickly means that you spend more time working with your actual application and less time rotating your certificates. So there are a couple of competing things here. The best way to do this one is to rotate frequently, but to automate the rotation. And we'll be talking about that. Another thing that's worth pointing out is whatever you are going to do for rotation, you must actually practice rotating the certificates. If you just wait until something happens, and that's the first time you've ever tried to do a rotation, your life will be unhappy. It's kind of like waiting to test your backups until somebody's machine catches on fire. So this is a thing where define the rotation practice, define the mechanisms, and then go ahead and do it a few times so that you're accustomed to how it works. Because when you have to do it for real, you'll be under more stress, and you might want to get it done quickly rather than fumbling around looking at the manual. All right. So,
Flynn, when you're talking about rotation, we're talking about the trust anchor and we're talking about the issuer certs, right? We're not talking about the pod.
Yeah,
certs.
The workload certificates get rotated automatically for you by Linkerd itself. You never have to worry about that. The biggest one to rotate is actually the identity issuer. If you set your trust anchor up correctly, its private key will not be in your cluster, and that makes it a little safer to not rotate it as quickly. Did that answer the question? Okay.
Yeah, that's right. So the pod certificates get rotated automatically.
Right.
The issuer and the trust anchor are kind of left to you to figure out what your policy is. And I guess our recommendation is that you rotate the issuers periodically and the trust anchors
less periodically.
Less periodically. But what rotating the issuer protects against is you accidentally publishing those, credentials to GitHub one day, or someone running off with them. And then if they have access to that, then they could come in to the cluster and start impersonating.
You can forge workloads. They can, bypass all of your authentication or authorization policies. Yeah. Another thing you're protecting against is screwing up RBAC so that anybody can just go ahead and read the identity issuer's secret key, because that has to be stored in the cluster.
There is a question, what's the best option to use
root CA for multi-cluster?
Root CA.
That's a pretty open-ended question. I'm not sure that I have an answer for that as phrased that generally. I guess the most general thing I can say there is that in all cases, in production, you would really want to use some sort of external certificate store for the root CA. Something like Vault comes immediately to mind. And if you're doing that, then using the same root CA for multiple clusters becomes pretty easy, right? You just configure your multiple.
Yeah, I think in practice, we've seen a variety of approaches, from people using Vault to people, just locking it away in a safe and saying, I've got this, 10-year trust anchor, and that's what I'm using. And, the benefits don't outweigh the drawbacks of rotating that. I think that's kind of, that's really up to your organizational policy more than anything else. I don't think there's really a best option.
Well, yeah, there is a best practice, which is don't have the secret key for the trust anchor in any of your clusters. Beyond that, it's going to be up to your organizational policies, as William points out. I've actually been hearing from some people these days that they prefer to rotate the entire cluster rather than rotating the trust anchor. So, it's time to rotate the trust anchor. Let's generate a new trust anchor, lock it in a safe, and then generate an entirely new cluster using it. Migrate over to that, which is certainly
that would work for the issuer, though, but not for the trust anchor, right? Won't the trust anchor be shared across clusters? Or is this a single?
That seems to be a single cluster thing. Yeah. Okay. Multi-cluster, I seem to mostly hear about people using something like Vault. Or one of
the reason we're doing all this right? The reason all this thing is like a thing is basically so we can authenticate identities.
Mhm.
The reason why trust anchor has to be shared across clusters is so we can authenticate those identities across clusters. So if you've got a multi-cluster setup, but there's no cross-cluster communication, then like, you don't necessarily have to synchronize the trust anchor. It's just, you won't be able to. They won't be able to communicate using Linkerd's multi-cluster capabilities unless the trust anchor is shared.
Right. So hopefully that answers the question. And there's a continuation there about recommending using Cert-manager. We are in fact going to talk about Cert-manager in this workshop. So yeah, Cert-manager is great. We like it. Okay, let's continue on. A quick reiteration of things that you will need for the workshop. We're going to use Step and Helm and Cert-manager and Linkerd. And I apologize for not having a link to Helm on this slide. I'm not entirely sure why I put Helm and Cert-manager together back in the dawn of time. So my apologies to the fine folks at making Helm. All right. So we're going to talk about several things during the workshop. We're going to talk about the basic skill of how to generate and look at certificates using the Step CLI. The Step CLI is pretty cool. There are a variety of ways that you can generate certificates. Step is one of the simplest ones. We will talk about a development setup where you're going to do all of this stuff by hand with a self-signed trust anchor. We're going to talk about how you actually rotate certificates by hand. Then we're going to do what I'm going to talk about, the almost production setup of using Cert-manager to rotate the identity issuer. And we'll talk about why I say that's almost production later as well. Finally, for homework, if you want to, you can fully automate everything with Cert-manager. That gets into a bunch of things where your environment's policies will dictate things. I see a question on Slack. Are we referencing Vault PKI or just using Vault to store the secret? Pretty much the PKI. Cert-manager has an integration with Vault's PKI that we kind of like for the stuff like this. We are actually not going to talk about that specifically in this workshop very much, but yeah, Cert-manager integrates with a bunch of things. Okay, let's see how well this all goes. Everybody can pray to the demo gods for us or something like that, or just enjoy the animated lobster typing on a computer. Okay, so let's get into this basic thing about how do we generate and inspect certificates using the Step CLI. The first one is, when in doubt, you can use step-help and start wandering through that. But here's the basic way that you go through and generate a certificate using the step command. And this looks complex, but we're going to go through and break down all the pieces here. -- profile, root CA in this case, tells step what kind of certificate to make. The particularly useful ones for Linkerd are root CA generates a self-signed thing that can be an actual root CA cert, and intermediate CA generates a thing that can be an intermediate CA cert. -- no password -- insecure you will generally see as a pair. No password says that we don't want to put a password on this certificate, and insecure tells the CLI, yeah, I know this is insecure, let me do it anyway. That cn.of.my.cert specifies the common name that will go into the subject of the certificate being generated. And then the last two arguments are the files in which to store the public and private key, respectively, when we generate this thing. For the intermediate CA cert, if you're generating one of those, you will also see -- and -- key. Those specify the certificate to use to sign the intermediate CA cert. And you can also use -- not after to specify when the certificate will expire. There is a not before if you want to generate certificates that can't be used until sometime in the future. And there are a bunch of other arguments that are kind of worth reading about, but we don't need for Linkerd. So we're not going to get into those too much. So simple run to make a root CA cert that we can use for Linkerd. Actually, that we could almost use for Linkerd. This is really just demoing what happens with the thing I just described there. It goes through and writes the certificate, aka the public half, into ca.cert. It writes the private key into ca.key. If we try to just take a look at that with head, we will find it's a bunch of base64 encoded crap as specified by the PEM standard, the privacy enhanced mail standard from 30 years ago now. But fortunately, step certificate has an inspect command that we can use to look at this. And if we look at this, we see a bunch of things. Some of these are more interesting than other things. We can see that the subject CN is, in fact, cn.of.my.cert. That's the same as the issuer CN because this is a self-signed cert. We get to see stuff about that. We get to see some X509 extensions. This tells us that the key in this certificate is allowed to sign certificates, and also it's allowed to sign certificate revocation lists. This one tells us that this is supposed to be a CA cert, and its pathlen is 1. We'll talk about the pathlen in a minute. This gives the subject key, this gives the basically a more human readable digest version of the private key that belongs to this particular certificate. And we'll look at that also a little bit later. There are a couple of ways in which you can actually use that, and it's kind of handy. All right, so to put this to use, we're going to use step to generate a self-signed trust anchor, and then use that to generate an identity issuer cert, and then use both of those to install Linkerd. And we are basically generating exactly this particular certificate hierarchy. This also talks a little bit about what pathlink is. If you look at this, and you won't be able to see my mouse on there. Oh yeah, there we go, great. Okay, so if you look at this, the trust anchor, we go one more hop to the identity issuer, and the identity issuer generates a leaf. The pathlen specifies how many intermediate certificates can be in the chain between a given certificate and a leaf certificate. So the identity issuer will have a path length of 0 when we inspect it, because it is not allowed to generate any other intermediate CAs. It can only generate workloads directly. The trust anchor has a path length of 1, because it's of at least 1, I should say, because it is allowed to generate the identity issuer and then from there generate workload certs. Okay, onward. So we're talking about this as a development setup because we're going to generate everything by hand. We're not going to pay a lot of attention to how we're storing the private keys, despite the fact that that is the critical thing to think about with private keys in production. We're just going to kind of ignore that. That's why we're calling this a development setup. We're going to do, well, a thing we're going to do correctly is that we're never going to put, at this point, we're never going to put the secret key of the trust anchor into the cluster. We will only put its public half. So that part we're doing right. The part where we're just generating the secret key in a directory on my laptop and not thinking too much about it after that, not so good. That's why this is a development setup. Okay. Here's how we're going to generate our trust anchor. This is going to look remarkably like the using step to generate a self-signed certificate from a minute ago. We are going to use the root CA profile so that we get a self-signed root CA. No password again. We're going to set this one so that it will expire in roughly 10 years, 87,600 hours. Steps not after durations don't have years and weeks and things like that. You have to do it all in hours, and the reason is step does not want to get into the business of dealing with leap years and leap seconds. We are going to name this one root.linkerd.cluster.local. That is the common name that the trust anchor must have in order to work with Linkerd. Don't try to change that. Then we're going to finish by writing it into trustanchor.crt and trustanchor.key. We do that, great, we have a trust anchor. We can inspect this one to make sure that it looks like a certificate. Important notes, its issuer common name and its subject common name are both root.linkerd.cluster.local as we need. That's good. And it is valid not before right now and not after roughly a decade from now. We also see path length of 1 down here, like I was mentioning. So let's go ahead. I didn't pray hard enough to the demo gods, so my demo script just stopped. That's great. So this is how you know we're doing this live, because I'm going to take a second to finish this, or to fix this properly. I'm not going to show you where I'm fixing this, but I am, trust me.
You want me to tell a joke or something, Flynn? Cover for you?
As long as it's not horrible jokes like what Jason always tells, go right ahead.
Yeah. No, I won't tell a joke, but I will try and say something intelligent, which is like the reason why we're doing any of this stuff. Like, why do we care about MTLS in the first place? Is I think is what we're trying to provide is connection security, right? So like the baseline that Kubernetes gives you is a TCP connection, right? And TCP connections have certain properties, but security is not really one of them. And so the reason that we want to do MTLS, which is annoying in many ways and involves all these certificates and things like that, is because it gives us the ability not just to encrypt that data, but also to authenticate it on either side. And the way we can authenticate it, and like the reason why we have these identities in here, is because we want to get out of the world of relying on things like IP addresses for a whole bunch of reasons. We don't want to do authentication based on your network location. We want to do it based on your workload ID.
Yep.
And so with MTLS, one of the things we can do is we can encode in that certificate, here is my ID, here's my workload ID, which is independent of where I am on the network. And that can be used not just to authenticate, on both sides, but also then to start building a policy. So everything we're doing here is kind of the basis of Linkerd's, which we're not going to cover in this workshop, is also the basis of Linkerd's ability to do very fine-grained policy based on, things like, oh, this service here is only allowed to call this, HTTP method on this service here, or is only allowed to call this gRPC method, or whatever it is. It all comes from this core capability that TLS gives us.
Yeah. And the reason we're not going to talk about authorization policy and things like that in great detail today is that there are other service mesh academies where we already talked about that. And so strongly recommended that you go check out those things, because there's a lot there. And I believe that in that one, we talk a little bit about why we are kind of down on network identity as opposed to proper cryptographic workload identity. Okay, I have fixed my demo script. What happened there was that earlier this morning, I was running just a section of it and forgot to remove a skip command. So we got to that point and it rapidly skipped to the end. So yeah, like I said, this is how you know we're doing this live. So we just generated a trust anchor. We are now going to use that trust anchor to generate the identity issuer certificate again by hand, again, without thinking too hard about how we're going to keep its private key safe. One important point here is that I said earlier, you really should never have the trust anchor's secret key stored on the cluster. You will need to have the identity issuer's secret key stored on the cluster. So on the one hand, you have to think a little bit less about storing it in safe places, but on the other hand, you definitely need to be thinking more about rotating it frequently, because that's the one that's the most likely to be compromised, since it has to have its secret key on the cluster. So another point, as noted here, is that the identity issuer must be signed by the trust anchor. It cannot be self-signed. It cannot be signed by some other random thing. So we'll be doing that with our step command. The subject CN must be this string, identity.linkerd.cluster.local. We're going to use the intermediate CA profile for this one, which means we have to use CA and CA key to tell step to use our trust anchor to sign it. And we're going to give this one a life of about 90 days or 2,160 hours. Okay, so there we go. There's our intermediate CA profile. We're going to use the stuff we just generated in our trust anchor to sign this. It's going to expire in 2,160 hours. Here's its CN, and we're going to store it in identity.cert and identity.key. All right. I just see a question here. Why don't we practice this with Helm charts? Because we're doing Helm charts next. That's why. This is all about how to do this with the minimal set of tooling, and then we'll go in and talk about Helm in a minute. All right. So if we take a look at our identity cert, then we can see that there are some major differences here. One of them is our subject CN and our issuer CN are no longer the same. Another one is that this not after goes out about 3 months instead of 2023. And another one is that this pathlen is 0 instead of 1. You can also see, by the way, that we now have this authority key identifier as well as the subject key identifier. And if we were to scroll up, we would see that, can I scroll up? Yeah. So here's my trust anchor cert when I inspected it earlier. Its subject key identifier starts with 9038674 Foxtrot 0. If I scroll down here, that's the authority key identifier. So this is a way you can inspect the certificates and then match up to be absolutely certain of which one signed a given key. Which one signed a given certificate, I should say. Okay, next up, we're going to install Linkerd, and then we're not going to have to think about rotation for 90 days. But first, we're going to make sure that the cluster can actually, support Linkerd. Okay, we have a single node K3D cluster in this case. This should work with anything really. I just used K3D because it was easy. We don't really have anything running on this cluster yet. It is empty. And hopefully Linkerd check -- pre says, yep, good to go. We can run Linkerd on this cluster. Incidentally, that also tells me that my Linkerd CLI is up to date, which was not true last night. Okay, so we're going to install the Linkerd CLIs, and then we're going to install Linkerd proper. We're going to use some specific options here, one of which is really just for my own testing. Oops. Okay, so first, trust anchors come from trustanchor.cert. This is only the public half of the cert. We are not going to mention anything on this command line about the private half. Issuer, the identity issuer certificate is here. We do talk about its private key because Linkerd needs access to both the public and private half of the identity issuer. This normally Linkerd issues workload certs that last for a day. Identity issuance lifetime is how you crank that time down. I needed to crank it down to 30 minutes yesterday while I was testing a couple of things. This is okay in development. You don't really need it unless you're really trying to go through and test a bunch of rotation stuff. So just bear that in mind as anybody who's watching this after the fact, bear that in mind. It's completely safe to leave that out for real usage. But man, it was handy for me to be able to crank it down for testing. So let's get that going. And after that, we'll run Linkerd check to make sure that everything is happy after that. William, if you have any other commentary, you've got a minute or so while we wait for Linkerd to finish running.
Commentary. Great job, Flynn. Really amazing. love what you're doing.
Yeah, you can tell we didn't rehearse this, huh?
Yeah, no, the other. So I'll provide some more background information, which maybe everyone already knows. But the other rotation is one technique in TLS certificates. The other thing you can do is revocations. You can actually issue these things and say, oh, that certificate is no longer valid. Like someone took it, don't use it. And the reason why we do rotation instead of revocation is basically because revocation is really hard to manage at scale. If you revoke one certificate, it's one thing, but if you are revoking a lot of them, and that's kind of your primary mechanism, then you have to store those revocations somewhere. Somebody has to read from that. You end up with this big database, and that's kind of not what we wanted to get into with Linkerd. So in practice, for something like this, the reason why we do rotation and short-lived certificates is because it limits the scope of certificate loss. So if someone exports your certificate, then worst case after 24 hours or whatever, it's no longer a problem for you.
But the revocation thing is a really, really good point about why it's important to practice this stuff, because if somebody up in your corporate security office comes back and says, hey, we just had to revoke the certificate that we've been using for your trust anchors, They probably did that for a reason. You probably do not want to just go, oh, I'll get to that next week. It'll be fine, right? So good reason to have some of this stuff already in your toolbox so you can just go ahead and do it. All right, so we've got Linkerd installed. Everything is great so far. Now let's talk about rotating certificates. The short version of this text is that if you're rotating the identity issuer, it's not that bad. If you're rotating the trust anchor, it's kind of annoying. So we're going to start just by showing rotating the trust anchor because it's basically the worst possible scenario. All right. The first thing that is worth doing here is you can always check the state of the proxies to see how things are going. There are 4 things that you might see that are very, very relevant for certificates in rotation. The first thing you might see is this warning here. This is basically saying, hey, your trust anchor is not actually valid for at least 60 days into the future. You will probably have time to fix this without downtime if you're checking this, on a regular basis. Because all you really need is, if you have complete control over your trust anchors, all you really need to do is have enough time to go through and, go through the process that I'm about to detail. This, if you see that red X instead of those yellow exclamation points, now you're looking at downtime. So don't ever let this happen. It is very, very important that you not have your trust anchors expire. You can also see exactly the same things about the identity issuer cert. It's just not as terrible if you get an expired one because it means less downtime. So I'm going to emphasize this once again. Do not let your certificate expire. This is particularly important in practice because expired certificates are the most common reason for actual Linkerd production outages in the real world. They're completely avoidable. All you have to do is keep an eye on it. Please, please, for the love of all that is holy, keep an eye on your certificates and don't let them expire.
Flynn, don't we provide some kind of free service that checks people's certificates for them and gives them an alert?
Shockingly, I think we might. I think it's this thing called Buoyant Cloud that I hope have a slide for, but if not, we'll make sure we point out a link to it. Yeah, Buoyant Cloud actually is very good at watching all of this stuff for you. It can tell you if your certificates are coming up on expiring. It's very, very good at that, and there is a free tier for it. So actually, William, I'm going to go on with this, and I'm going to let William put something in one of those lower third banners about how you can find Buoyant Cloud.
Oh boy, we really have lots of exciting technology available. Let me figure out how to do this.
This is the danger of emceeing an SMA. You might get asked to jump in and do things. There we go. Eric just posted it in a Slack. https://buoyant.io/cloud. So, yeah, there are, being completely, as completely serious as we ever are anyway, there are a lot of different ways you can watch certificates. You can show up at your desk every morning and run Linkerd check. That's a way to do it, right? I don't recommend that way, but you can. You can set up your very own monitoring using Grafana or your favorite monitoring solution of choice, or there are billions of them. Or you can use Buoyant Cloud, as is showing up hopefully on the lower third of your screen right now. Obviously, we at Buoyant recommend Buoyant Cloud, but any of these will work. And the critical bit is that you keep an eye on this so that you don't let your certificates expire. Okay. So remember that rotation means replacing a certificate with another certificate. So the first thing that you have to rotate a certificate is you have to have a new certificate to put in its place. So we're going to use step again to generate a shiny new trust anchor and a shiny new identity issuer. And we're going to do these with much shorter expiry times than we did beforehand, because shorter expirations are better in terms of security. I'm going to reiterate here that a compromised key, somebody who compromises a key is generally not going to post something on Slack saying, hey, I just compromised this key. They'll just steal it, quietly start using it, and you might never hear about it. So if you rotate the certificates more quickly, that will have a strong mitigating effect on what can happen when one of these things happen. And in many environments, as we've already talked about, you may have to deal with certificates being revoked. And if your trust anchor gets revoked, then you probably want to be able to act on it pretty quickly.
There's a great question, Flynn, from Chetna. Do we need separate root certificates for control plane,
and webhooks? I strongly recommend it. If you're going to automate webhook rotation by having an anchor for the webhooks, I would suggest not using the Linkerd trust anchor for the webhook trust anchor. I don't have a specific thing to point at for why you should do this. It's a general good practice in security that if you have things that exist in completely separate usage domains and separate security domains, you probably don't want them directly sharing trust anchors. If that makes sense.
Yeah, it's not gonna break anything. It's just
break anything. Yeah,
it's weird.
But well, I guess one immediate direct thing is that if you do share the trust anchor between the two, then anytime you rotate the trust anchor for the control plane, you must also deal with all the webhook certs at the same time. Not going to lie, it's a little bit weird to me to think about how you would manage that particular kind of a dependency. It'd be a little hairy.
Eric has a good answer in the channel. He's saying isolation of trust and principle of least privilege suggests that you keep them separate. Exactly. Okay. So we're going to generate a trust anchor cert with a validity of 2 months, 1,440 hours, and a new identity issuer with a validity of 1 week, 168 hours. I literally made those numbers up out of thin air. Please do not assume that they will be correct for your environment. Think about what works in your environment before you decide to pick up these numbers. I'm not going to go into great detail about these step commands. They're exactly the same as they were beforehand. We're just changing the not after timestamps, and we're also changing the files to which we write these things so that we don't stomp on the previous set. So there's our new trust anchor. In the validity section here, it is now valid only till September 18th of 2023. That's close enough to 2 months. Sounds good to me. And the issuer certificate, again, same as beforehand, but we're doing 168 hours and we're using them with new identity. We're also using the new anchor to sign this rather than the old anchor. Okay. This one, the validity section, goes from today till about a week. Okay, good to go. Actually, that looks like exactly a week because a week is short enough that we don't really get into crazy things unless you're doing it at the end of February. All right. Okay, we have new certificates. We're going to go in and show the rotation. This is a multi-step process. It requires a certain amount of care to get this right without taking any downtime. Watch carefully and definitely practice this on your own, preferably not in production your first time. Overall process here, we're going to take the new trust anchor and we're going to put it in what's called a bundle with the old one. This basically makes both of their public keys available to Linkerd so that Linkerd can temporarily correctly validate certificates produced from either trust anchor. After doing that, we would restart any meshed workloads. In this particular demo environment, we don't have any meshed workloads, but we would restart all the meshed workloads so that the proxies for those workloads pick up the new trust bundle. Then we can rotate the identity issuer so that it will be signed by the new one, and then we can remove the old trust anchor from the bundle so that none of the old certificates will be considered valid. Everybody got that right? So off we go. First thing we're going to do like heart surgery. Where
kind of.
You're trying to keep the patient alive. Like heart surgery is a lot easier if you don't have to keep the patient alive the entire time. But if you're
heart
replacement surgery, You know,
Yeah, heart replacement is really easy if you don't care whether the patient dies.
right,
So
right.
we would like the patient to not die at all. So
And
first
that's
thing we're
why we
going to
have
do
to
here,
use a that's why we have to do a bundle.
yeah. So the first thing we're going to do here is we're actually going to use kube control to read the old trust anchor out of the certificate. I know I have it lying on disk in this particular point, but I'm going to show this as if I didn't, because this is a way you can do this and be guaranteed that you're getting the correct old trust anchor. You're getting the one you're actually running with. And there's nothing particularly magic here. The trust bundle lives in Linkerd identity trust roots. It's a config map in the Linkerd namespace. And we are going to grab the ca-bundle.crt key out of its data stanza and just dump it into a file called original trust anchor.cert. This is almost the last time we're going to be inspecting stuff because you already know what certificates look like. But hey, look, there's really a certificate in there. And also, look, it's the one that lasts until 2033, and its subject key ID starts with the thing that we saw last time. So that's good. This is the right one. Okay, next up, we're going to use step certificate bundle to put our two certs into a bundle. This is kind of like the MV command. So you list all the ones you want to go into the bundle, and then the last argument is the file name to save them into. There we go. Very profound. Finally, we're going to use Linkerd upgrade to tell Linkerd to use that new trust anchor bundle. And off we go. We also need to make sure that our control plane fully restarts after this point, or things will get very confused.
So that's not actually upgrading Linkerd. That's just our hack for generating a manifest, right? And then Kubernetes
this is kind of
the hard work.
Yep. You're going to see hacks kind of like this in a couple of places where, Helm upgrade kind of works the same way if you really get down to it. Okay, so now our control plane is fully restarted. And if we had any meshed workloads, we would restart them at this point. We don't, because I didn't feel like taking the time to put any in here. Okay, once you finish with your restarts, then you can go through and do this one. Interesting point. If we... Okay, so first off, let's let that get all the way at the end. Status results are good. But if you scroll up here, our trust anchors are not valid for at least 60 days because it turns out that when I did it, it was valid for 60 days at the moment I ran step certificate create, but now it's a couple of minutes after that, so they're not quite valid for 60 days anymore. I guess the reason I bring this one up is that you should always actually look at that message to figure out when things are expiring and keep in mind whether it's what you want or not. Okay. So now we're going to continue with rotating the identity issuer since we just finished the first part of rotating the trust anchor. We've got both the old one and the new one are present in our bundle. Everything is great. Now we can rotate the identity issuer. Quick note here, and I'm going to point you to the Linkerd docs, which go into more on this one, but you must have a valid trust anchor to rotate the identity issuer. If you get into a place where your trust anchor has expired, you cannot rotate the identity issuer until after you fix the trust anchor. Something to bear in mind. And once again, we need the identity issuer cert needs to be signed by our new trust anchor. That trust anchor must be valid and it must be in the trust anchor bundle. So since we just rotated the trust anchor, restarted meshed workloads, all that, we're good on points 1 and 2. We've already generated a new identity issuer cert, that 1 week cert that we did a few minutes ago. We're good on point 3, so we can just keep going here. And all we really need to do is do another Linkerd upgrade command, which, as William pointed out, is not actually upgrading Linkerd. We're just using it to generate a manifest to apply.
I called it a hack, but really I should have called it an elegant application of existing functionality.
Elegant and finely crafted solution. These are the same command line variables we used for Linkerd install, by the way. We're just giving them different values. So we are now going to just sit here and watch for the issuer updated event. And this has always taken a little longer than I want it to. I've never quite been sure why. It doesn't really take a long time. It just takes long enough that when you're doing it in a demo, you get nervous about whether or not it's working.
It's probably doing some really important computation right now.
Or something. Yeah, I'm not sure exactly what. But, whatever. Honestly, if this doesn't go, this takes a little bit too long, I'll just go ahead and continue on without it and let it run in the background. There we go. Okay, like I said, it always takes enough time that I get nervous about whether or not it's working. But all we're really doing there is just watching with this particular thing, and we see that that happens. So now the identity issuer has been updated, and we can be happy about that. At this point, you have an interesting choice to make. If you look at our documentation, it will say you need to restart all your mesh workloads right now. In fact, you actually don't. You can wait for the next time Linkerd needs to rotate the workload certificate for your meshed workloads. If you do this by default, that could be up to 24 hours. If you do this and you've deliberately cranked down the issuer expiry, it could be shorter than that. In any case, restarting the meshed workloads by hand is definitely a more deterministic way to do that. So if you've started off by rotating the trust anchor, I personally would recommend that you restart the meshed workloads by hand, just so you can know that the old trust anchor is out of the picture, because the next step is to remove the trust anchor from the bundle. And we basically do that just by running yet another Linkerd upgrade where we switch to only the new trust anchor and not the bundle at all.
So that very first set of workload restarts was required, right? That was to get the trust anchor bundle onto every workload. Once that's there and you update the identity issuer, there's an optional set of restarts.
There's an optional set of,
or you wait 24 hours.
Right.
But you need either way, you need every workload to have a new certificate issued by the new identity certificate before you move on to removing the trust bundle, the old thing from the trust bundle.
Yeah, exactly. And that is why this gets to be kind of a complex thing. Okay. And also, once we've removed the old trust anchor from the trust bundle, here's another place you really should restart the meshed workloads here again, so that they throw away the old trust anchors cert entirely, to make absolutely certain that nobody could continue using it now that you've gotten rid of it. So
just because it's old doesn't mean you don't want to use it, Flynn.
Well, it depends. Did it expire? Was it revoked? Or did you just feel like rotating for the fun of it, right? If you felt like rotating for the fun of it, then yeah, continuing to use it is probably great. But if it got revoked, you probably don't want to continue using it. You probably want to make sure nobody else can continue using it too. So that is how you go through and you do all of this manually rotating your certificates. You'll note that we actually ran Linkerd upgrade 3 separate times here. The first one, we took the old and new trust anchors, put them into a bundle, and then switched that one. And then we used a second upgrade to swap the identity issuer. Then we did a third upgrade to get rid of the old trust anchor from the bundle entirely. And yeah, this is a good one to read through and practice a few times. All right. I do not think I see any unanswered questions in Slack. So let's continue on from. Cool. Rotating expired certificates. We are not going to demo this in this particular workshop. And the reason is, if you have an expired certificate, then you're taking downtime, and I don't particularly want to demo downtime type stuff. Especially, I don't want to encourage people who are following along to be running these things on their clusters and crashing them or whatever. But you do it exactly the same way we just did for rotating stuff. If it's your identity issuer that expired and your trust anchor is still valid, you only have to deal with the identity issuer. If your trust anchor has expired, you need to generate a new trust anchor, generate a new identity issuer, go through the whole thing that we just did. Although there's no real point in bundling the trust anchor because you're already taking downtime. So this is a homework assignment. There's a file in the repo that talks through how to do it if you feel so inclined. All right. Now let's talk about Cert-manager and how we're going to use this in an almost production setup. I say almost production not because of Cert-manager. I say almost production because doing this for real in production requires knowing a lot of stuff about how you're going to deal with your trust anchor, and we can't really do that in a demo environment. It's going to depend too much on your environment. I will point out here that what we're going to actually show is the bootstrap part where Cert-manager creates a certificate out of nothing for us. The rotation part at that point is literally, hey, let's wait for Cert-manager to rotate something, and we're not going to wait that long here either. But it should be, that's the part that I worry the least about with Cert-manager, really. So,
and just as a time check, we've got 25 minutes left. Is that enough time to go through this and Helm?
I believe it is enough time. I believe it is. We always have the option of just kind of skipping stuff and talking about it. So we'll go on for a little bit. The other thing we're going to do here is we're going to continue to use our self-signed trust anchor that we generated with STEP, even though we're going to use Cert-manager for the identity issuer. On the one hand, like I said, in a real production setup, you should be using something outside the cluster in general. But also that whole business where you had to go through and do the bundle and then restart things and then remove the old bundle afterwards is actually really difficult to automate in a fully general way. It tends to be something that takes some care for your individual environment. So what we're going to show is using Cert-manager just for the identity issuer. And as you want to work with your own environments, we would encourage you to go on and figure out how to get that working correctly for your environment as well for the trust anchor. Okay. One of the weirder things in the demo, we will uninstall Linkerd because the way we're about to be doing this with Helm is different from the way we did it last time. All right, I am going to interrupt that one and go on to installing Helm. Or rather, go on and installing Cert-manager using Helm. We had a question earlier about, hey, why aren't you using Helm? This is the part where we are using Helm. So let's get Cert-manager going. I just checked in another window. My Linkerd namespace is in fact gone, so that's good. This is another one that always takes long enough that I worry that it's not actually working. There we go. It's working. Great. Okay. So now we have Cert-manager installed and we're going to configure it. The way we're going to do this in our world is we will use a cluster issuer using a trust anchor stored in a Kubernetes secret, which means we're going to do exactly what we always said never to do, and we're going to put the secret key of the trust anchor in the cluster. Like I said, this is almost production. Doing this for real in production, don't put the secret key of the trust anchor in your cluster. We are at least going to be putting it in the Cert-manager namespace, which Linkerd should have no access to. But yeah, if you are going through and configuring this in the real world, you're still going to have an issuer or a cluster issuer with this name in this role. You'll just be configuring it differently to use whatever external CA story that you have set up. So after we have the issuer set up, we will then create a Cert-manager certificate resource to tell Cert-manager how to use our issuer, our cluster issuer in our case, to generate the identity issuer certificate. And that will go into the Linkerd namespace because that's where Linkerd needs it to be. All right. First things first, we're going to do the thing that you should never, ever do. And we're going to go ahead and put the trust anchor into a TLS certificate. Off we go. I feel like I need a shower already. And after that, we will apply this manifest for a simple cluster issuer. It's literally, we're going to call it Linkerd trust anchor. We are going to put this in the Cert-manager namespace because that's where our secret lives. And we're going to tell it that, yeah, just use the Linkerd trust anchor secret in the Cert-manager namespace as the route that you will use to issue new certificates. When we apply that, we should be able to just immediately get the cluster issuer and see that it is ready. It is ready. Excellent. That means it was able to find its secret. It thinks everything is okay, and it's ready to issue certificates. After that, we need a certificate resource for the Linkerd identity issuer, and that needs to be in the Linkerd namespace, which does not exist yet because we have not installed Linkerd yet. So we're just going to go ahead and create that by hand, and then we will apply our certificate resource. There's a lot more to a certificate resource, but don't panic. We're going to call this Linkerd identity issuer. This goes in the Linkerd namespace. A lot of the rest of this stuff is just describing what the cert looks like. So the common name must be identity.linkerd.cluster.local. It needs to be a CA cert. These are the things that you want to allow it to be useful for. We're going to set this up so it expires in 2 days, and it must be renewed before 25 hours before its expiration. That comment's actually wrong. I'll have to fix that. We want it to be issued using our cluster issuer named Linkerd Trust Anchor. And yeah, we're going to continue doing this. Sorry, we're going to continue with an ECDSA key like we have before, and it must be written into the secret Linkerd identity issuer. All right, we apply that. And we should be able to see that certificate resource also showing up as ready with this secret. So if we look at that secret, then we can go ahead and take a look at that and see that it has 3 elements in its data stanza. TLS.key is its private key. TLS.cert is the public half of its cert. CA.cert, as an added bonus, is the public half of the CA that we used, which in our case is going to be our trust anchor. So if we take a look at this, if we pull out that TLS.crt bit from the data stanza, we will get a base 64 version of the base 64 certificate. So, I mean, it's silly, but that's the way Kubernetes works. So we can grab that, run it through base 64-D, and then feed it to step certificate inspect to see what it looks like. Oh, look, it's a certificate. That's great. We can see things like it lasts for 2 days. We can see that the issuer's common name is root.linkerd.cluster.local. Its common name is identity.linkerd.cluster.local. Overall, this looks good as an identity issuer cert. We can repeat that for ca.cert and take a look at the trust anchor if we want to make sure that, hey, look, this is the same subject key ID we've been seeing all along. And if we scroll up a bit, we can see that that's the authority key identifier as well. I should also point out, I'm only looking at the first 4 bytes here because this is a demo and I don't feel like rattling off all, 20 of them. But yeah, if you want to do that for real, you can check all of them. So finally, after all that, we're going to use Helm to install Linkerd. So we'll set up the repo, and then we'll tell Helm to install the Linkerd CRDs. And sorry, I have a funny look on my face because I just realized that version that I fed it might be wrong. So I'll be checking that to make sure that I didn't get the wrong one. When we install the control plane chart, we are going to tell it explicitly, hey, here's the trust anchor bundle I want you to use. And we are going to tell it explicitly that the identity issuer is already present in a TLS secret, so please don't go off and create one. That command looks like this. It's pretty much literally just run Helm install and feed it those extra commands, those extra parameters. And off we go. We can run Linkerd check to make sure that all of that actually worked. William, you have anything to toss in while we're waiting for Linkerd to come up and run? I just like making him click the button to appear and disappear. That's really what's going on.
Just, you need to press the turbo button on your Kubernetes cluster so we can get through this faster.
Yeah, it's not like I have a fast laptop or anything. Only.
Is this all local?
Yeah.
This on your...
Yeah. Oh, I'm running K3D and OBS and the browsers and all this stuff local.
Okay.
And my
Well, getting your
machine
money's worth.
and my machine's at about 50% CPU because I actually do have a fast laptop. It's really nice. Okay, so this all worked. That's great. Now, at this point, Cert-manager is handling rotating the identity issuer cert for us. It will do that completely automatically. This is great. I'm not going to demo this process of going through to rotate the trust anchor using Helm and all this stuff, but I am going to talk through it. And some of this is going to feel a little bit odd. It's basically the same thing that we did earlier, just modified with Helm. So you start off creating a new trust anchor certificate in a bundle. That part's great. To get the bundle updated, you don't use Linkerd upgrade anymore. You have to use Helm upgrade because we installed with Helm in the first place. If you try to use Linkerd upgrade comes back and says, dude, Helm controls this. I'm not going to touch it. So we need to use Helm to do it. It's basically the same Helm command, but you're changing out this and you're switching from Helm installed to Helm upgrade. Not a big deal. After you do that, you restart the meshed workloads. After you do that, you then go and update the Linkerd trust anchor secret as stored in the Cert-manager namespace. This command is uglier than I thought it would be, and the reason is you can't run kubectl create secret twice because it knows that the secret was already there. Instead, you do this horrible, ugly thing that basically tells kubectl create secret, no, really, just spit out the YAML and let me apply it. After you do that, you will at this point have a new trust bundle in place. You'll have the secret and the Cert-manager namespace updated, and that gives Cert-manager the ability to update the identity issuer for you. We don't really want to wait for it to have to do that. So instead, the easy thing here is to use the CM control command line interface from Cert-manager to force it. Just give me a new identity issuer, please. After you do that, you can either wait for the workload certs to rotate or restart the meshed workloads by hand. And then you rerun Helm upgrade again with just the trust anchor to get rid of the old one from the bundle. Yes, William.
There was a question on Slack, though. I see we got an answer from Eric, but for the posterity, people listening to the video, how can you utilize the identity issuer and the Helm chart without including the certificate as a parameter or directly inside the Helm chart?
Yeah, and Eric's answer is correct. You can put that into a Kubernetes secret as well. I mean, really, if we back up a second here, then if we back up in the correct window. So here, we're not specifying the secret to use. We're just telling Helm, hey, there's already a secret in the cluster, use that, right? There is another parameter that you can provide that will do exactly the same thing for the identity issuer, or sorry, for the trust anchor. That's what Eric is talking about. Where basically you just tell it, hey, something external has already dealt with all this stuff. I believe that there's actually a way where you don't need a secret for the trust anchor. All you need is a config map that has the public half. So I will go ahead and nail that down and update something. Actually, I'll probably just reply in a thread in Slack after I look up exactly what the parameters are for that. But yeah, there's a way you can do it. The way that I'm showing here has the nice feature that it gives you complete control over everything, and it demonstrates exactly how you can make things work this way. But there's also another tool in kind of with Cert-manager. There's another one called Trust-manager. Trust-manager is capable of looking into that secret in Cert-manager namespace and then just copying stuff into the right config map for the trust anchor bundle. It's worth a look. It makes it a little bit tricky to sort out exactly how to get the bundle updated so you can restart the workloads before you update the secret. But we have demoed that in the past as well. And yeah, it's worth a look. It could easily be exactly the kind of tool that you want for the scenario that's being described right there. And I have to apologize for not explicitly mentioning the Slack user who's asking those great questions. And that is because I no longer remember how to read Hebrew well enough to be confident of pronouncing their name. So sorry about that. Okay. Here's what you're going to end up with after you go through all this stuff, just to give everybody a quick overview to see what's up here. In the Cert-manager namespace, you have this secret called the Linkerd trust anchor. In the Linkerd namespace, we have a config map, not a secret for the trust roots. That's the config map where we find the trust anchor bundle. As you can see, it is pretty literally just showing up there. We also end up with a secret called Linkerd identity issuer in the Linkerd namespace. That's the one that Linkerd will be using to generate the workload certs. Okay. One more thing. Actually, let me check over here and make sure that there's nothing else that we can answer from Slack before getting on to our one more thing very quickly. Yeah, I think the remaining question deals with the config map thing that I was just talking about. So I will go through and post in the Slack channel about that. One more thing, webhook certificates. We're not going to demo this because we're out of time, but you can, in fact, set up Cert-manager to handle rotating the webhook certificates in exactly the same way. You would basically use a cluster issuer or an issuer to tell Cert-manager about a webhook trust anchor certificate, and then you would use certificate resources for each of the webhooks to tell it to generate that. There is documentation on the Linkerd website that talks about this in great detail. Again, we do not recommend using the same trust anchor for the Linkerd control plane and for the webhooks. We recommend keeping those separate. We do recommend that you keep the webhook anchor off cluster in much the same way that we recommend keeping the Linkerd trust anchor off cluster. The certificate resource that you generate for Cert-manager to deal with webhooks will be the same. What we're going to be changing is the way your cluster issuer or your issuer is set up to reference that off cluster store. And there's a link to the Linkerd documentation. Okay, I believe that is it. There's our summary.
Oh my gosh, we made it.
Yeah, there's our summary with all of the documentation links for you as well. Basically, go to linkerd.io/2/tasks and look for things that talk about, rotating, and you'll find them all. I guess we have a couple more minutes if last minute questions come up. There is a lot here. There's a lot of theory behind all of this, as well as a lot of actual, practical stuff. So yeah, it's worth reading some of this stuff and worth practicing for sure.
The other thing I'll point out is Linkerd 2.14 is coming out soon. It's not going to change any of the stuff.
Oh, so man, everything you learned, we're not going to fully automate all the certificates for everybody.
No. But that's coming out. It should be next month. We're going to have an SMA in about a month from now, covering everything you need to know about cool multi-cluster goodies that are coming up in 2.14.
Yep.
So you can register for that right now, buoyant.io/SMA. And it'll be Flynn again.
It'll be both of us again, but that one I'm actually going to have to let William present. That's wow.
That's right. Yeah, I get to talk on that one. It'll be a little less typey and a little more talky.
Yep.
And probably a little shorter too.
But I think we are. My plan, at least, is to actually have a demo of some of the cool new multi-cluster stuff. So that should be fun. Everybody keep your fingers crossed on that one.
All right, last chance for questions. Type them now.
Going once, going twice. Well, I mean, not really. Just while we're waiting to see if there are more questions, let me flip back to this one. As William pointed out, August 17th, be there for what's coming up in Linkerd 2.14. The QR code will take you to the same place as the sign up today link. Hope to see you there. And I believe that that is it. Yeah, that's it. You can email me as flynn@buoyant.io. You can Slack me on the Linkerd Slack channels as @Flynn. Actually, that works on the Linkerd Slack, the CNCF Slack, the Kubernetes Slack, the Envoy Slack, the Ambassador Slack,
and the Cert-manager Slack.
I'm not sure it works on the Cert-manager Slack. I should go join that and make it work. But yeah, there we go. Thanks very much for joining. Appreciate it from everybody. Thanks, William, for emceeing, and off we go.
My pleasure. Thanks, folks. Happy Linkerd-ing.
Have a good one.